Bond Educational Group. Each Friday at noon, we interview leaders in education and business about how equity shows up in our industry. I'm Dr. Beth Frida Jackson, the Director of Research and Grant Administration for the Bond Educational Group and the moderator for today's discussion. And before I introduce our guest, I want to remind our viewers that the Equity Summit is quickly approaching. If you can believe it or not, we are halfway through 21. And so with February 8th through the 10th in 2022, we have our Equity Summit. This event will be 100% virtual. So be sure to go online and purchase your ticket. You can purchase it at www.equitysummit.com. And our theme this year is Rising Together. We're even more excited about our speaker lineup this year. So for more information, please do visit our website. And we just look super forward to seeing everyone. So without further ado, I am absolutely ecstatic to have for our webcast this afternoon, Ms. Maria Marukian, the president and founder of MSM, Global Consulting. And I have to say, this is an exceptional opportunity because not only is Maria the president and founder of MSM Global Consulting, but she's also a dear friend. We've had the opportunity to work together. And it's just absolutely fabulous when friendship gets to cross domains around the conversation of equity in spaces and like interest. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Maria. And if you could tell us a little bit about your work, and I will just look forward to having a great dialogue this afternoon.
Thank you, Bev, so much. I'm so ecstatic to be here with you, and it's an honor to be able to have this conversation. So a little bit about me and about my organization. I've been in the space of organizational development, organizational transformation, with a particular focus and specialization in diversity, equity, inclusion, intercultural competence. Been doing this for almost 20 years, which is hard to imagine, especially because you and I probably go back almost that far. But I really see this work as not only a career, but it's a purpose. It's a call to action, and I think something that has always been deeply embedded in how I live my life. Just being the daughter of immigrants, growing up in a multicultural, multilingual family, that sort of intersection of cultural differences, and kind of always wondering how I can support those whose voices have been silenced. Where can we leverage the advantages that we have to grow, to learn, and to advocate for others. So that's something that has just, I think, followed me, been a deeply held value for me, and has definitely been a part of my work and my research over the last 18 years. So MSM Global Consulting is a consulting practice. We provide really organizational transformation services. So everything from needs assessments to understand the landscape and sort of the current baseline of any organizational culture as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, who's having what kinds of experiences and why, so that we can help the organization's leaders to make really informed and thoughtful decisions to develop their strategic goals around DEI, and to really help to enact some change. We provide training, we provide coaching. A lot of my work is dialogue facilitation, which I think is so incredibly important and necessary, especially in these very polarized times, where even the words diversity, equity, inclusion can have some electricity around them, right? So a lot of the work that we do is engaging folks in thoughtful, honest, heartfelt dialogues to identify where we have some common cause and purpose, and to use that as an opportunity to look at where we have some divergent perspectives and how we move forward. So that's the work that I'm passionate about. We are partnering with a whole different, just so many different types of organizations, from federal government agencies to nonprofits and associations, to corporate entities and educational institutions. And so I think what's so fascinating about this work is it really does touch every sector, every industry, and every person, regardless of who we are and where we come from. These these identity dimensions that we bring with us are so critical to how we live our lives, how we behave, how we interpret other people's behaviors. And so I have seen, especially in the last couple of years, such an increase in interest from organizations to really do this work in a meaningful way rather than just kind of a check the box, say we did it. And that's been a really fantastic trend that I hope continues. But yeah, that's a little bit about MSM Global, a little bit about me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I love how you were sharing that you're seeing more, I'd say, commitment from organizations, more of an intentional, targeted, just real, I guess commitment probably is the best word, to the conversation, to true diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just the Band-Aid solution. Because we'll flow through a series of questions, but then also to just have a conversation this afternoon to really talk about how equity shows up in our workspaces. And part of what I would love for us to explore some more is around, that Band-Aid effect is real. And we will often see that, the checking of the box, as you said so eloquently. So, what does that need to look like? How do you move past that? What does that space look like, especially when we talk about intentional equity and meaningful equity, diversity and inclusion, when we really look at the umbrella of terminology? So, first off, I would love for us to really think about the word equity in definition. I think it's mission critical when we talk about terminology. Language is so powerful. And when we talk about language, being sure that we're on the same page, that the parameters in which we're understanding language is very important when we contextualize dialogue. So I wanted to just pitch to you to start off. When you think of the word equity, what most immediately kind of comes to mind, and how would you define it, especially being in this work and having such a rich institutional base in it?
So equity for me it's promoting fairness by addressing injustice. It's about creating a level playing field for those who have been historically and continue to be marginalized, oppressed in our society because of some dimension of their identity, often a dimension that they don't have much control over. And I love, I'm not actually sure who is the originator of this metaphor, but it really speaks to me. If you think about an oval racetrack, right? A runner's racetrack. And I did track and field when I was younger. I'm a runner, so this really captured my attention. But when you think about that oval racetrack, the outer lane is longer than the inner one, just by nature of the shape of the track. And so if all the runners started at exactly the same starting point, the people on the inner lanes would have an unfair advantage because they simply don't have as far to run. So they stagger the starting points of the racetrack so that the people on the inner lane are actually starting a little bit further back than the people who are in the outermost lanes. And everybody still has to run the same distance, but you're ensuring that people who have the capacity and who have the capacity and the ability to engage in that competitive race, nobody has an unfair advantage. Everybody actually has the same distance that they have to run, and they can actually compete in an equitable way. So for me, that's kind of an interesting metaphor when you think about equity versus equality, for example, right? Equity is about giving it's not about giving unearned advantages to people. It's actually recognizing that some folks already have unearned advantages simply by being a part of a group that has held power, that has held privilege in our society. And in order for us to be intentional about narrowing that gap, we have to ensure that we're providing opportunities for growth, for mentoring, for development, for career advancement, for people who perhaps have not been given those same opportunities in our society.
No, that's awesome. And I'd say a natural touch point in terms of, I love how you wove in kind of equality too, because I think in this work, as we have watched the conversations evolve, there's been a pivot. You would often hear, well, everything is equal. You hear equal a lot, right? And then there was the pivot to equity. and really the very intentional shift to make sure that there was a concrete understanding of the difference between the two terms, and that the distinction is very important. I love the metaphor that you use relative to the trek. I actually too, as a sprinter, so I didn't have as much of the track to run around, but I can definitely appreciate that. And there's also a phenomenal image, and I too can't quite recall the artist, but it's three young persons looking over a fence. And so I love that visual. And the great part is it really is about leveling the playing field when you're talking about equity and equality, because for a while there was a comfort space and saying, well, things are equal. And then when you really started to unpeel, well, how are we defining equal? What does equal look like? That's when it really became important to make the distinction between equality and equity being that opportunity for resource allocation that truly level the playing field. So that image has everybody equal on their stance, but equity has everyone at staggered steps so that everyone can see over the fence appropriately. So there's definitely an evolution, which I think has been quite nice to see, the landing in the space of focusing on equity versus being very comfortable in saying the term equality and thinking that that was good enough and quite fine. The other piece, that I think is fun for us to explore now is how does that get applied? So we talk about these terms, we talk about equality, we talk about equity. We know that it's important to conceptually understand them from a philosophical space. We can define them. We can grab a dictionary, we can put it on a whiteboard, we can be very academic, right, in terms of how we define something. But how do we apply it? What does that look like? What's the real-time application? So I wanted for you and I to just converse a bit about, the application of the term, not just from the conceptual base, but taking it to that next space. What does that look like for you?
So, before I get there, I just wanted to acknowledge what you said, because I think it's so important. This is, although this is sort of a somewhat more new intention that we see organizational leaders kind of putting this lens of equity versus equality. These concepts have been around for so long. Ancient philosophers, Aristotle talked about this distinction between numerical equality and proportional equality, right? Which is essentially equity. And, recognizing that we can't just give everyone the same goods or services. We have to make sure that people are getting things based on their relative needs. And so, when we pull that back and think about what does that look like in practice, it's about shrinking the gap between those who have more and those who have less. And I think, in terms of within an organizational environment, and I know we'll probably talk about this a little bit more in terms of how we take this beyond just the Band-Aid approach, but it starts with a mindset, recognizing equity requires us to recognize that meritocracy is a false narrative, right? And that our system, our structures, our society is set up to provide automatic unearned advantages to some over others. And it's not to place blame or shame on the people who have been on the receiving end of either the advantages or the disadvantages. It's something that we have to acknowledge and recognize. And so I think that's really kind of the starting point. And then it's looking at how do we build in policies, practices, and procedures that help to narrow that gap, not in a way that is perceived as a zero-sum game where we're taking away from some to give to others, right? This is not us being Robin Hood. It's looking at the very real fact that there are structures that have existed for a long time that have pushed certain people out of the advantages and opportunities that other people have had, and that over from generation to generation, that has a compounding effect, right? So when we think about, for example, specific practices, there are equity promoting fairness, right? So there's a lot of research that shows that, and you and I have probably experienced this, men will apply for a new position even if they don't have all of the existing qualifications, right? So they'll say, oh, well, I've got some of these and I'll figure out the rest. Women will not apply unless they feel like they have all of those qualifications. And there are numerous studies that have shown this, right? So as an example of equity, a leader might encourage a female colleague or direct report to apply for a position, even if she doesn't have all of the qualifications, and maybe provide some additional guidance, advice, sponsorship to help prepare her for the interview process and how to handle some of those questions where she might not necessarily have the confidence in herself. And I know that sounds so simple, but I think it acknowledges the fact that that for some there's an extra layer of challenge that can come even with perceiving themselves as able to go for that next step in the ladder. It could be difficult for an employee of color who is maybe in a lower level role, especially if they are one of the very few people in their organization that represent that racial or ethnic minority, to see themselves as able to make a career shift, right? I'm stuck in this is what I have to do, and there aren't a whole lot of opportunities for me to grow. I don't see a clear career path in front of me, and I don't have a mentor in my organization that's providing me with that information. So even, equality would be, we post the job description on the company website. Anyone who has access can apply if they have the proper qualifications. Equity would be, I'm going to specifically, work with that individual and say, let's see if, let's walk through this resume. I think you have the potential to be able to apply for this. Just in terms of, benefits, hours, accessibility of spaces, right? There's so much that we can be doing to equity requires intentionality. I'll give you an example. I was recently asked to do an assessment, a survey for a public school, an elementary school, to ask, we've got much more engagement of some parents than others. And there tends to be, there's a socioeconomic differential there as well as a race differential, right? So, most of the people who are very actively involved in the school community are white affluent parents. And they asked me to create a survey. Well, in addition to thinking through what are the questions that we want to ask, we really had to take a step back and say, how do we make sure that this survey is going to not only be accessible to the entire school community, but maybe we really want to be more intentional about reaching some of those parents, guardians, family members that aren't necessarily going to hop online, and click on the link to a survey for a variety of different reasons, whether it is availability, whether it's, internet access, whether it's language, whatever the case may be. So we took it one step further. In addition to making the survey available, SurveyMonkey, go ahead and take the questions. We also we translated the survey into several different languages, and we created, we created printout copies, and then actually provided them when parents were dropping their children off at school. And then in addition to that, we worked with the school counselors and administration to actually invite some of the family members. We got on the phone with them and read the questions to them, and then got their responses right on the phone. So it's just taking that extra step allowed us to actually have access to voices and perspectives that we wouldn't have if we had just plastered the link to the survey in the newsletter or the email that maybe some parents open, maybe some don't. So that's just one example. I think what makes equity sometimes a little bit more challenging for organizational leaders is it does require us to be more intentional and creative in the way that we can't just do things the way we've always done them. And so I think that is where sometimes we kind of get stuck, because organizations keep redoing their practices the same way, and it ends up serving the same people.
No, I love that example, because when you'll often hear entities will say that they have a wide array of services, and be very ecstatic about, we've got so many services. And then when you ask the question about access and utilization, there's a pause. And there's a pause because there hasn't necessarily been the opportunity to really rethink, and kind of retool. How are we thinking about accessibility? A wonderful service array can be phenomenal. However, if you don't have persons able to access those services, or if accessibility to those services is limited, then you really need to kind of rethink that model. So I love how you kind of frame for us that equity, it does require taking that next step. How do we operationalize it? What does it look like? We oftentimes, we work in our silos, we work in our comfort zones. That's what that looks like. But equity kind of, it nudges you, maybe punch kicks you a little bit into a space that forces you to kind of think of what that looks like on the other side. I love the idea of, there's, the convenience of online is phenomenal. And you did like a miniature needs assessment, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, it's like, that was like a mini needs assessment in terms of, you met your client base where they needed you to be, right? In terms of whether that was going to be a phone call, whether that was going to be online, kind of really in a very intentional way, making sure that all those bases were covered so that you had the best representation, quite honestly, of your participant pool, which is excellent, and a wonderful example of kind of how equity in action, what that looks like. I also wanted to ask you, as you were talking, so those are great examples of how we can apply equity. What about metrics? Like, we will make mention of organizations not having the Band-Aid solution, which I think we both are like, we're psyched about that, psyched to see more of that. But also too, there needs to be a way for us to operationalize it, to think about it, to measure it. So what, in your mind's eye, we think are formidable metrics that really get us there in terms of seeing if we're getting the kind of progress that we so seek around equity in our respective institutions, organizations, and the like?
Yeah, I think that there are sort of different layers to measurement. And I'm so glad that we're seeing more organizations step forth and apply some measurements, to this, because that adds in a layer of accountability and I think sustainability for these efforts. Okay, going back to where does bond, right? We are putting it out there that we're making this commitment, and now we actually have to follow through on it. So, a few of the sort of measurable goals, I think, at the initial layer, looking at self-reporting and sort of learning, or where certain practices are changing to accommodate a more diverse population is a good starting point. So, for example, salary parity, right? For employees at the same level. I mean, that sounds so simple, but it's incredible to me how many organizations, when they actually do an audit, realize that there are people who are in the same positions, who have the same qualifications, but there's a significant differential in terms of pay equity. So I think, just something as simple as doing desk audits and identifying, from a pay equity perspective, how do we equalize that? Employee survey results, again, in terms of that self-assessment, asking people what their perspectives are in terms of equitable, decisions that are being made. Do you believe that leadership makes decisions that are equitable? Do you believe that you have equal opportunities for career advancement to your peers? And sometimes that self-assessment piece, or that self-reporting element can yield some really good information. A little bit more subjective, but it's the experience that people are having. And so a lot of times what we see when we engage in those questions, is that you might have certain groups, whether it is women, whether it is BIPOC individuals, whether it is members of the LGBTQ plus community, who are saying, actually, I don't think that I have the same opportunities, or I don't feel as deeply satisfied with the career path, or the knowledge about the career path, or my input into decisions that are impacting me. Or the practices, and policies that the organization has in place to support people. Um, I think equitable performance management and succession planning practices are really important too. And, kind of going back to one of my earlier examples, and I think this is just part of human nature. We tend to gravitate toward people who are like us, right? And we often, when we see it as a leader, as a manager, if I'm looking at the people that I want to mentor, advise, kind of sponsor in their career path, without realizing it, I might be focusing more of my energy and efforts on people who remind me of me in some way, shape, or form. And so part of this is leaders becoming more intentional about expanding their social networks, looking at who else in the organization should I be providing some mentorship to? Should I be cultivating their career path rather than just looking at my small number of folks that are in my immediate sort of line of sight? And then, in terms of succession planning practices, making sure that there is equal representation with fast track leadership development programs, for example. To make sure that there is equitable representation of diverse employees in terms of high profile tasks or projects or assignments. Because again, I think a lot of times leaders grab the person who they're closest with, who they have the closest relationship with, who they enjoy working with, who has performed well for them in the past. And so they keep going back to the same well, to the same well, to the same well. And there are other folks who are equally competent and have great potential, but are sitting there saying, I'm not getting the call, right? I'm not getting those same opportunities to prove myself. And so it just kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think really getting past those blind spots, and leaders have such an incredible role to play in this, in terms of looking at how do we make sure that we are being very intentional about building opportunities. And in doing so, that it's not seen as lowering the quality of the work, and it's not seen as charity. It is seen as in the best interest of the organization overall, and that the more diversity that you have on a team, the more diverse voices, perspectives, experiences you have, the better results you get, right? So I think that's equally important, and maybe not as easily measurable, is the mindset, the perspective, and the culture that is being cultivated around seeing equity as a value add to the organization and not as a compliance metric.
Nice. No, you said two key terms that I think are phenomenal for kind of the close of our discussion relative to what entities can do around what'll stick, accountability and sustainability. And it's interesting because there is a bit of, I don't want to call it the sell, but kind of around diverse teams. And we've got scholarship. There's a lot of scholarship writings. And again, we can be so academic with this conversation, right? Around the value add, but in also two diverse teams. So we can take it back to looking at even case law, looking at how important the execution and utilization of diverse teams, how that helps to improve performance across teams from a cognitive space. But being able to really reinforce that in our institutions, that becomes some work in terms of really having entities understand that, and also too, that accountability. I love how the metrics, it forces the hand on accountability. It's its own CQI, right? It's its own continuous quality improvement cycle, because we do often go back to the well, it's comfort. We often go to our comfort spaces. We work in our silos, right? But then how do we get punt kicked out of that to be able to expand our spheres? The scholarship on diverse teams and the value add around diverse teams forces the hand on how you do that and do that well. And then from a sustainability places, I think you made mention of what entities and what organizations can do internally. So that's maybe the recruitment conversation. That's the retention conversation, because you can have opportunities where there's a revolving door scenario, and that's challenging. You can diversify the team, and then guess what? The team doesn't stay. So then what do you do? What is put into place? And I think, part of of this conversation is not just there's the actionable piece, but there's the cultivation of the equitable space and creation of a culture. And creation of the culture, I think, is really when I was hearing you, I'm like, that's what needs to happen. And I think a lot of what you were sharing in terms of whether it's pay equity, whether it's how we rethink who we're leaning on, that's cultivation of a culture that institutionalized. This becomes how we do business, not just something that we're going to try out, but it becomes something that is a part of how any organization, any entity, that they're day to day. And it also requires, to a degree, that individuals that are a part of that entity, that are a part of that organization, that they co-sign on this philosophy, that they co-sign on the actions that are a part of not just an initiative, but an operation. So, what do you think it takes for organizations to truly implement? And, there's so much around implementation science. It's a big word. It's a big, big word. But non-Band-Aid solutions, that you're cultivating equitable spaces, but even more so, you're creating a culture that helps to sustain, and that's sustainability, super huge, but helps to sustain what we so seek. What are your thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on that, Bev.
Yes.
So a couple of really critical levers that must be in place. First and foremost, you have to have visible and active support and commitment from leadership, and that requires more than just a statement that's put out or one training session on managing bias, right? And I'll give you an example. There's one organization that we've been working with over the last year where we have had monthly sessions with the leadership team over the course of 9 months, and built throughout the course of that time a sense of cohesive understanding of the importance of addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and what that means. So a lot of deep self-reflection for these executives to engage in, not just individually, but with one another, to create that space of vulnerability, to share their own blind spots, and to kind of struggle with some of these topics. And I think that's really important, especially for leaders, any leaders, especially leaders, though, who do come from advantaged identity groups, white people, cisgender people, men, because they are more likely to have blind spots. The more privilege we have, the more blind spots we have, and the less ability we have to take on the perspective of those who don't have those same advantages. And it's not meant to be a finger wagging toward people. It's just, if it's in your blind spot, you simply don't see it. And when you don't see it, you don't prioritize it. And so I think that takes time to sort of unpack and get people more comfortable and more willing and able to speak out as advocates when they've been able to do the work in a safe space. So that's one thing I think is really providing some support, but also some accountability for leaders to really walk the talk when it comes to this, and to think about, in terms of all of the decisions they're making, how can they put an equity lens on it? What does that look like? What does that sound like? Secondly, I think it's really important to these kinds of efforts cannot just fall on the shoulders of one or two people. It can't be thrown into HR and said, you deal with it. It's got to be seen as an organizational priority, a strategic priority. You have to have systemic DEI goals with a solid plan, and you have to have people in place with roles and responsibilities to implement it. So whether that is a DEI council in collaboration with the executive team, whatever the case may be, but you need people to really feel that there's a sense of ownership over this. And I think thirdly, to that end, communication is really important, so that people do take some ownership and see this as a commitment, not as compliance. And I'll give you a quick example. I was having a conversation with an organizational manager who said to me, I'm really struggling with something. I have been told by HR We've got, 3 positions available. 2 are going to be filled internally. And the one that is open to somebody from the outside, they said it has to be a quote unquote diversity hire. And I'm really struggling with that because I don't like being told. It makes me feel like I'm being told what to do and who to hire, and that I'm not trusted to make a decision. That, am I somehow, what if I compromise the quality or the standard? What if I have to hire somebody, but that is not going to be a good fit for the team, right? So all of this anxiety, frustration, and defensiveness that came with that, you must. And so we worked that through, and we talked about, we talked about that person having that emotional reaction, and taking a step back and asking, what is the intention of the organization? How has that been communicated? And also, how can you see this not as a win-lose or a compromise? How can you see this as an opportunity? And how do you address that? If you came from this perspective of, by being intentional and committed to hiring for diversity, because I know it will be in the best interest of my team and the organization, that's something that I'm going to keep in mind as I'm going through the process, rather than, well, I've been told I have to hire somebody, a diversity hire, and what does that mean, and who fits into that. And but I think that, I offer that because I think that there is so much emotion that comes with this work, and organizations and leaders have to be really thoughtful about their communication strategy so that they can get their managers, their employees on board and see this as something that we all need to commit to. Because otherwise what happens is you get folks who find workarounds, who engage in what we sometimes call malicious compliance. They'll do it, but they will do it unwillingly. And as you were mentioning earlier, then you have a revolving door, because somebody comes on board and they don't feel like they have been fully accepted. They don't feel like they have the opportunities to contribute fully to the organizational culture. And so they leave. So I think that that's a really important part of culture change, and just recognizing that, this does take time. So we have to keep the momentum up. We also have to sort of manage the fact that there are going to be iterations to this work too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that you give us some key nuggets in terms of what organizations need to do. I love walking the talk. Walking the talk, not just the lip service component. Well, here, it sounds great, but walking the talk, what does that truly look like? So Maria, thank you so much for the opportunity this afternoon. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience before we close out? This has been an exceptional discussion. Just super grateful to have the opportunity to sit with you and just talk about equity and just kind of, converse about what this needs to look like in our workspaces.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bev. It's been an honor. And I actually am in the midst of finishing up a book that's going to be coming out in January 2022. And it's a comprehensive guide for people in the training and professional development industry. In particular, how do you embed diversity, equity, inclusion into your learning development, into your transformational change initiatives? So yeah, if people are interested in learning more about what does this look like and how do we enact that long-lasting change, then the book will be out hopefully in January.
That's phenomenal. We'll definitely keep a lookout. And that's, the key to sustainability, right? The true keys to sustainability. So thank you all for tuning in today. As a reminder, the Equity Summit will be virtual. It'll be held on February 8th through the 10th in 2022. Be sure to log on to theequitysummit.com and purchase your tickets today. Thank you so much. And we look forward to continued Word is Bond podcast in the forthcoming weeks. Thanks so much.